Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll be discussing how to multiply signed fractions. So the first thing to note before we get into actually the multiplication process is, again, if you watched my signed fraction addition, you'll see this as familiar. So there are a variety of ways to indicate that a fraction is negative. One way is to have the negative sign out in front of the fraction. The other way is to have the actual negative sign in the numerator position, so along with the numerator number, in this case 2. And the third way is to have the negative sign with the denominator number, so in this case with the 3. All of these are equivalent, and if you want to know why, it has to do with our rules for dividing integers. So if you divide a negative number by a positive number, that gives you a negative overall. And after all, a fraction bar is just a symbol for division. So looking at the last one, we've got a positive number divided by a negative number. That would also be negative. And then the first one is supposed to be the opposite of a positive over a positive. Well, positive over a positive is positive, and the opposite of a positive is negative. So in all three cases, you end up with a negative number. Okay, the second example is, well, what if you have a negative on top and on the bottom? So if you have something like this, for example, a negative over a negative, well, let's think about it in terms of our division rules again. A negative divided by a negative is positive. So this is the same as just plain old 8 over 7. Okay, now what I'll say is that out of the first set of equivalent fractions, the middle one is going to be the most useful for us. So whenever I see fractions in this form or in this form, I'm going to change it right away so it's in the middle form. Okay, likewise, if I see a negative over a negative, right away I'm going to change that to this other form. Since they're the same, the second form is much simpler. So let's do example number 1, and we'll go through it step by step. So example number 1, we're supposed to multiply 5, 6 times negative 8 over negative 7 times negative 2. Well, notice that these first two guys are written as fractions, and this last number is not. So my first step is to rewrite as all fractions. So what I mean by that is the first one is already a fraction, so I don't need to rewrite that one at all. Same with the second one. But the third one, instead of having negative 2, you can always write an integer as a fraction. Negative 2 would be the same as negative 2 over 1. Okay, negative 2 divided by 1 is negative 2. So step 2 then in the process is I'm going to put my fractions in those useful forms. So use useful fraction forms. So you'll notice my first one is just 5 over 6. Well, that can't get any nicer than that. The second one, negative 8 over negative 7, that's the one we talked about before. The top and the bottom are negative, so I'm going to rewrite that as just 8 over 7. And then the last one, negative 2 over positive 1, well, that's in that nice form that we talked about. The fraction overall is negative, and the negative sign is with the numerator number, so I'm going to leave it as it is. And then step 3 is just to multiply what's left. So when we multiply fractions, we multiply tops and bottoms. So we've got 5 6 times positive 8 over positive 7 times negative 2 over 1. So 5 times 8 is 40. 40 times negative 2 is negative 80. And on the bottom, 6 times 7 is 42, times 1 is 42 still. And then the last step is just to reduce this as much as possible. So since both numbers are even, I'm going to divide top and bottom by 2. Negative 80 divided by 2 is negative 40. 42 divided by 2 is 21. And that is as simplified as this fraction can get. Okay, your turn. So I want you to try number 2. Pause the video and then restart it when you've had the opportunity to try it. Okay, so again, the first step in number 2 is to rewrite all the fractions as, all the numbers as fractions. So that's going to give us negative 2/3 times negative 7/5, and then we've got this whole number, which we could write as 7/1. Okay, the second step in the process is to rewrite each fraction in the useful forms that we talked about over here. Well, these fractions are already written in that useful form. So I'm just going to rewrite what we have, even though I don't necessarily have to do this step. It's just for the sake of consistency. And then the last step is, since we now have everything in useful form, we're just going to multiply our tops and multiply our bottoms. So negative 2 times negative 7 is 14. 14 times 7 is 98. And on the bottom, 3 times 5 is 15. Times 1 is still 15. And that fraction is not reducible. So that's as far as we can go.